Hi gang, Vigilus has gone through a lot recently, what with the invasion of the beasties and then the arrival of the nightmarish forces of Abaddon the Despoiler. But while the planet was now safe from invasion, the struggle for control was far from over as a terrifying new power assaulted the planet. That's right, Emperor Botherers. Hey look, I've got merch now. Have a look below or stay tuned at the end to find out more. So we're now 3 books into the story of Vigilus and the Nachmund Gauntlet. Well, at this point it's still Vigilus. We'll absolutely get to the rest of the Gauntlet in the next book. And for this next part of the story, we've jumped a whole edition. The War of Beasts and War of Nightmares were 2 of the central plot elements of the 8th edition of Warhammer 40k, detailed in Vigilus Defiant and Vigilus Ablaze, as well as some supplements. With the launch of 9th edition, the conflict ground on, but with a slightly different tone. Vigilus was now a war-torn world, its problems not ones of external invasion, but of the enemies already at large on the planet. And the next campaign book in the series, Vigilus Alone, would tell the story not of waves of alien invaders and titanic battles, but of the rather more sinister war waged to bring Vigilus under the yoke of the Imperial faith. Vigilus was a wreck of a planet. In the months and years since the opening of the Rift, the former industrial world had suffered again and again at the hands of the Imperium's enemies, first invaded by the Speed War of Cruel Daka, and then the Genestealer uprising of the Pauper Princes. The planet endured the War of Beasts, holding out along with a swathe of displaced Imperial forces at the northern edge of the stable corridor that was the Nachmund Gauntlet. But even though Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines had arrived and broken the various beasties, the planet was soon engaged in an even more destructive war. The War of Nightmares saw Abaddon the Despoiler assault the planet from above with hundreds of Chaos Warbands, assisted by Demonkin, with an overall plan to disrupt and destroy the blackstone deposits within the planet's crust that kept the Rift at bay. The Warmaster of Chaos used an ancient weapon known as the Void Claw to cause seismic disruption on the planet, toppling many of the Hive Spires, and his invasion felt poised to succeed when an attack on his flagship by the Eldari of Saimhan had forced him into retreat lest he lose his greatest asset, the ancient Gloriana-class battleship Vengeful Spirit. But the gamble had cost the Imperial Defenders dearly. Calgar was borne away by the Ultramarines, both his hearts split in single combat with the Despoiler, and with him now presumed dead by many of the Imperials on the surface, the Ultramarines' High Command falling back from the world, and Abaddon returning to the Void, confusion reigned across the planet. On the Forge continent of Megaborealis, the Adeptus Mechanicus representatives from Styges fortified their mining operations, continuing to harvest Blackstone even as the fires raged in the depths. The great Omniscient hoist that led to orbit had been snapped, and the areas destroyed by its fall had become a hunting ground for Skitarii clades, elements of the Pauper Princes and the rogue demon engines of the Brazen Beasts. And in the nearby industrial sprawl of Storval, a failed gambit by the ruling Magos there to use the lava flows that fed its industry as a weapon had backfired, turning the Hive into an ash-choked and lava-encrusted waste. The Mortwald Hive sprawl had been toppled from without by Iron Warriors, and from within by Slaneshi demon forces running amok, and the defenders that manned the remaining loyalist areas of the Hive sprawl were frequently under-resourced and undermanned. Many Imperial forces in the region, clinging on to the defense networks, were luckless penal regiments now trapped between the Orcs in the Wastes and the Chaos corruption at the center of the Hive. The slums of Dirkden Hive sprawl had been taken early on by the Genestealer cult and was still their remaining bastion on the planet, having resisted invasion by the Night Lords in the previous war, while Dontoria Hive was silent, fallen to the squabbling warbands of Nurgle and the Gelapox as exhausted Imperials tried to maintain a quarantine cordon in its outskirts. Otek, once the site of great water reservoirs to supply the planet, was considered lost, its ancient hollows tainted by corruption, though bands of Adeptus Orators and Space Wolves had ignored the instruction to retreat and still hunted Xenos through the dark tunnels and overflow pipes, and the planet's moon of Neo Vellum, bypassed by many of the invaders, was still the site of running battles between heretic Astartes and Imperial forces, its astropathic choir maintaining a thin and fragile connection to Imperium Sanctus. And while the capital, Hyperia, had held out in the face of numerous attacks, the Vigilus Senate doing whatever they could from Saints Haven, the outskirts of that hive sprawl were under combined attack from corruption spread from Doria and the forces of the Thousand Suns, who, along with the ever-present Drakari raiders, returned, marching from hidden webway gates in the frozen polar continent of Kalax Bane, and the centre of the hive sprawl was still a hotbed of corruption and chaos cult activity. Abaddon's departure was almost unnoticed by his various lesser commanders, their warbands running riot and burning themselves out in the depths of the hive. And now, back in the void, he could see himself becoming unhealthily obsessed with Vigilus, the same mistake he'd made with Cadia over the millennia, and so he redirected his efforts towards the Greater War, throughout the Nachmund Gauntlet, dispatching his herald, Harkon Worldclaimer, ahead of him with a massive Chaos Armada, and leaving his lesser commanders to continue the fight for the ruined Vigilus, while he went and got involved in the whole Arcs of Omen storyline and I guess sort of took on a more managerial role. The Chaos forces that had survived the disastrous retreat from Vigilus were retasked to support other war fronts, such as on nearby Orgalnafor, where infiltrating Black Legion forces, who had stoked and raised cults in the heart of the world's cities, were slowly being defeated by a huge Astra Militarum response, trench lines spreading across the planet's single giant landmass. The Chaos reinforcements saw a Black Legion fleet punch through the system's Navis Imperialis defenders, precision lance strikes obliterating Astra Militarum command stations, and waves of mechanical beasts and veteran Astartes assaulting the lines. Within a week, the tide had been turned when the Imperial commander, General Dosar of the Cadian 203rd, had been killed when his capital Imperialis was assaulted by raptors, and the defenders had evacuated back to the capital at Gerondis. A desultory few made it to the evacuation ships, and even fewer made it out of the system, heading to reinforce Vigilus as the world of Orgalnafor fell. Those reinforcements would be sorely needed. Just as Abaddon's forces had redirected, so the Adeptus Astartes strike forces had started to leave Vigilus, reassigned to more urgent battlefronts, and the defenders on the planet started to lose cohesion. Some Ultramarines remained, assisted by detachments pledged by the Wardens of the Gauntlet, those chapters active or based in the Gauntlet itself. The Wardens had united under the guidance of the Castellans of the Rift chapter to share information and coordinate resources, but they were sorely needed across its whole length, frequently fighting against piratical activity from the fallen night world of Daravar. The Knights of House Terran were still on Vigilus, sometimes supported by Freeblade Knights who'd escaped Daravar and fought for the Imperium, and numerous regiments of local Vigilant Guard and other Imperial Guard forces were still active defenders of the planet, but without central leadership, they continued to enact Calgar's standing orders. Calgar the Saint, Calgar the Martyr. Marneus Calgar's apparent death had led to a cult of adoration to Lord Macragge, Saint Marneus Calgar being venerated across the planet, their faith stealing the defenders even as cults to the dark gods spread in the darkness. For while Abaddon had left, his commanders on the planet continued their war. Black Legion forces like the Hounds of Abaddon and the Iron Spines and masses of traitor guardsmen, feared regiments such as the Pelasian Pantheistic Corps, Feresk Truthsayers, and Gobril Divine Indenturists have been left to their own devices. They still fought in distant areas of the Hyperia hive sprawl. One particular test of Imperial faith was the campaign waged by the Word-Bearer's Dark Apostle Vandek Cathar and his sometime ally, Clawmaster Regerin of the Night Lords. The two commanders hated each other, but their joint campaign to defile and break down symbols of the Emperor led to the destruction of numerous newly raised shrines or reconsecrated temples. But an Imperial reinforcement fleet was coming from the nearby Yolaris system. Dispatched by the Adeptus Ministorum, the Crusade of Mina's Consecration was a colossal force, comprised of Navis Imperialis vessels pledged to the faith, Ministorum invasion cathedrals, and 9 massive capital ships, and it carried with it thousands of battle sisters of the Order of the Bloody Rose, led by the terrifyingly aggressive Canoness preceptor Corin Hrethnar. The fleet had originally been mustered to prevent the fall of the Yularis system to an approaching heretic fleet, but as the Crusade approached the system, the warp twisted and the rift expanded to devour the whole of Yularis. The eddies resulting destroyed many of the Crusade ships and killed many of their navigators, and when the fleet finally managed to translate safely back into real space, it was near the edge of the embattled Vigilus system. Canoness Hrethnar eager to deploy her forces and reap the tally of heretics that she'd been denied at Yularis. Disgusted equally by the presence of vile traitors and Xenos on an Imperial world, and by the confusion exhibited by the defenders in the wake of Calgar's departure, Hrethnar rammed her remaining ships through the remnants of the Chaos Fleet in orbit and deployed to Hyperia, rousing the local preceptories of the Bloody Rose to her side and quickly forcing the Heretic Astartes, still active in the High Sprawl, into a withdrawal, galvanizing the defenders with impassioned speeches and furious battle anger. At the same time, on the edge of the Vigilus system, a strike force of battle sisters from the Order of Armated Lady, who were the dominant force on Vigilus until that point, had embarked on their own crusade. The moon of Hearthlack was the site of the Cathedrum of Accession, originally built to honour the ecclesiarch Sebastian Thor in the 37th millennium, but the cathedral had been desecrated by Wordbearer's forces during the opening stages of the War of Nightmares. The sisters led a vengeful strike force who, aided by the faithful of the Vigilant Guard, retook the moon and reconsecrated the cathedral, dedicating it to the martyr Marneus Calgar. However, Hearthlack was an arid rock. It relied on atmosphere processors to remain habitable, and during the fighting, those processors were damaged. The atmosphere that was generated from that point on was a thick ochre colour, which trailed out behind the moon as it travelled through the system. A golden halo drawn across the sky in the name of the Emperor and of Calgar. The sight of it filled the defenders of Vigilus with faith, and many would travel to worship at the cathedral over the next few months, most of them dying after an hour or two and having to be removed by reclamation servitors, as that thick yellow cloud was, of course, extremely toxic. Many other Imperial forces arrived in the months since Calgar's apparent death, but one of the more important was Inquisitor Erasmus Cavolus. The mailed fist of the Ordo Malleus, Cavolus was learned in occult lore to an incredible degree, a veteran inquisitor who dedicated his life to subverting the machinations of chaos, often using their own knowledge to do so, which was always a risky path. Instead of demon hosts and possessed weapons, which he rightly decried as heretical, Cavolus's speciality was in the breaking of unholy wards and bonds, and the unmaking of demonic magic, studying the texts of long-dead Xenos and vile cults so that he could find and seal rents in the fabric of the universe. Cavolus had tried to study the spread of the Great Rift closely, piecing together strands of lore and information until his trail had led him to Nemendgast, where his infiltration team had witnessed the Black Legion Masters of Possession creating the first Noctilith Crowns, massive blackstone portals that weakened the veil between the warp and real space. The heretic Astartes and demon engines of the planet were beyond his ability to defeat, and so his team withdrew, but it was Cavolus who had warned Marneus Calgar about the world, which led to the dispatch of Strike Force Shadowspear and the War of Nemengast at the very start of the War of Nightmares. In his deployment, Cavolus was accompanied by the Black Iconoclasts, an elite inquisitorial detachment of warriors, hunters, and marksmen, recruited from the most war-torn units, most remote penal colonies, and high-security execution forts in the Imperium, screened for any trace of corruption, and equipped to a standard only the Ordos could afford. His scrying had centered on what he thought was the next threat to Vigilus, the emergence of the Noctilith Crowns, built by the Wordbearers near the end of the War of Nightmares, and now hidden, still being constructed in hive sprawls across the planet. The structures of the Noctilith Crowns pierced deep into the planet's surface, and their polarized blackstone rings thinned the veil between the warp and real space, tapping into the veins of the planet and slowly spreading corruption through the world. In his opinion, there was no time for subtlety. The first crown he discovered was in Mega Borealis, but the tech priests of Styges were less than helpful. When the Inquisitor requested cartographic data on the planet, the omniscient adepts wavered and delayed, scrutinizing every scrap of information before they were willing to pass it on to him. The rest of the defenders were no less suspicious. The cowled Inquisitor and his sinister warriors moved from district to district, conducting their own search without explanation, causing many of the local Astra Militarum and PDF regiments to wonder if they were the target of his investigation. Eventually, his own psychic senses, attuned and assisted by an army of psychic retainers, discovered the source of the corruption. He deployed his private army into the south of the Hiveplex at Grisport, finding the structure of a Noctilith Crown still being raised by a cult loyal to the Wordbearers, who were currently engaged in a running series of raids with nearby Imperial Guard forces, who in turn had no idea what it was the cult was building. Revealing his identity to the terrified Astra Militarum commander, Cavolus immediately ordered a full assault on the position with all assets. The guardsmen backed up by chimeras full of grim, black iconoclasts who cut down the swarms of cultists and mutants that emerged from the site. Finally, the Inquisitor himself committed to the fray, opening his skin-bound tome and reading aloud the rite of unbinding to break the structure's connection to the warp. But in the process, as the connection died and the unfinished crown became inert, Cavolus had a vision, a glimpse of the network of crowns already constructed on the planet, situated on key ley lines and slowly dragging the rift closer. While the majority of forces on Vigilus continued to enact St. Calgar's standing orders, the Inquisitor started to split his own forces and requisition more. He was about to engage in a private war, and he couldn't be everywhere at once. He travelled to Hyperia to meet with Canoness Hrethnar and the commander of the Order of Our Martyred Lady forces on the planet, Canoness Blaze, and explained to them the severity of the situation, gaining their trust, and then he descended on any remnant units and armies he could find. Astra Militarum regiments, Sororitas missions, even a company of the Imperial Fists were all cajoled or in some cases threatened into placing themselves at the disposal of the Inquisitor. Units of war-weary guardsmen were combined to create new regiments, ragged bands of veterans were re-equipped for their new role, and strike forces were formed, all given tasking orders by Cavolus' staff. He even met with a new commander of the Vigilant Guard, Proctor Commander Threnedis, who had proven something of a religious zealot in the previous months, and she pledged the support of the planet's PDF forces wherever she could. He took some care not to disrupt the standard defensive plans of the great St. Calgar. The larger armies remained in place, buoyed by the knowledge that they too were doing the Emperor's work. After all, anyone witnessing a crown and surviving would likely be executed to prevent corruption anyway, so it made sense not to risk the great armies of Vigilus. And probably not realizing that, the ragged forces at the Inquisitor's disposal spread across the planet, following their assigned leads in strange mixed regiments, clades of Skitarii marching alongside Astra Militarum armoured columns, battle sisters supported by Aeronautica squadrons, and Imperial Rough Riders marching in support of swift Astartes actions. At Otek Hivesprawl, Major Legance of the Black Iconoclasts masterminded an attack on a Noctilith Crown held by Wordbearers. Cavalier regiments from Talan, Bullgrin breachers, and Aeronautica assets pressuring the Heretic Astartes from three angles, while Cavolus unmade their demonic essence and set hexagrammic mines around the crown. At Boar Hive Ultris in Mega Borealis, a week-long assault eventually resulted in the destruction of another crown once the defending Black Legionnaires were forced back. But that assault went on so long it did pull forces away from other areas of the Hive and bled them dry, leaving the outskirts open to attack by Orcs and Genestealer cultists, but at least the crown had been destroyed. And some forces just found nothing. The Catachan Company Jaggers Devilskins raided the farmland around Mortvold in search for their assigned crown for days, but ended up chasing remnants of the cults into the countryside rather than locating any more structures. The nexus of the network seemed to be at Storval Hivesprawl, ruined earlier in the war by a colossal magma eruption. The remaining sprawl was a war zone fought over by many different Chaos warbands, the Brazen Beasts, the Octed Brotherhood, even degenerate Spireborn who had turned to their base desires and preyed on the lower hives in the name of new gods. Down in the darkness, the magma destruction had led to the emergence of pyroclast cults, and a new demon forge had been created by Black Legion warpsmiths, creating new crowns that formed a colossal warp gate. When the Inquisitor arrived at Hive Magma Thermid on the outskirts of the sprawl, he found the Imperial leadership surrounding the Hive in disarray, the Vigilant Guard bogged down in seas of ash and conducting mismanaged halting advances. The Inquisitor's arrival was like a meteor. Enraged at the sloppiness, he had his acolytes set up mobile excoriation racks and strapped the commanding officers to them, torturing them live, their screams broadcast to every Imperial Vox in range, along with his word that he'd do the same to everyone in Storval if they didn't immediately follow his orders. Within an hour, companies of guardsmen, cohorts of Scutari, and many thousands of labourers poured out of Hive Magma Thermid in a mass of terrified zealotry, whipped along by the Sisters of Battle. The tide of humanity pushed through the Hive, suffering horrific losses, but overwhelming many of the cults and warbands that met them. The soldiers crushed many of their own underfoot as they jostled for position, many of them desperate for the Inquisitor to see them fighting. But Cavolus and his iconoclasts only committed themselves to battle when the wave of terrified humanity reached the central forge complex around Phaistos Mound. Storming into the battle, the demon smiths of Storval were eventually fed to their own machines, and the Inquisitor started the rites required to close the gates, even as the Black Iconoclasts started to round up the Imperial survivors for execution. Despite incredibly heavy losses, the Coronal War was racking up an impressive tally of successes, and the effort was seen as being looked on favourably by Saint Calgar, causing many within the Hives, or on the constantly arriving refugee ships, to sign up for the defence forces. Or at least with the propagandists of the Inquisition active, that was definitely the line. In reality, every new influx of bloodied, maddened or exhausted travellers became yet another shovel of fuel to feed the planet's pyre of sacrifice. Most were simply rounded up by logistics officers, the bloody weapons of fallen warriors thrust into their hands before being pressed into immediate frontline service. But the Inquisitor himself did harbour similar sentiments. The tides of madness had died down across the planet as the crowns were destroyed, and Cavolus saw this as the hand of the Emperor reasserting control over the sector, a belief that would soon be reinforced. The Black Legion warbands had witnessed the risings of a new tide of faith in the population and had rightly designated Saints Haven as its probable centre. The spires of the capital were the centre of the oversized Ministorum presence on the planet, their palaces and cathedrals dotting the Hive structure, and more than that, it was the site of the ascension of Saint Calgar. In a well-planned attack, the Black Legion attempted its destruction. Their forces, supported by thousands of cultists who boiled up from the streets below, whipped into a frenzy by Astartes' Dark Apostles. The Imperial Defenders found themselves under colossal attack as the citizens of Saints Haven started to give up their anguished prayers for salvation, but a miracle manifested within the towers of St. Bartham. In a flash of golden radiance, the Emperor's light radiating out in all directions, the hero martyr of the Palatine Crusade, the living saint Celestine, manifested on Vigilus, driving back the Black Legion forces once again, alongside a wave of impassioned Imperial citizenry, the faithful throwing themselves into combat around her. Celestine led the defenders to victory, tens of thousands martyring themselves to defeat the Black Legion. As the funeral bells started to ring across the spire, she then made all haste to Mega Borealis, where Canoness Hrethnar had set up a command post, her sisters supporting Fabricator Vorsh in the defence of the Forge complex. Celestine summoned Hrethnar back to the command post and ordered her to pull her forces back from the forges. There was a more pressing target for the Adepta Sororitas. The true source of foulness on the planet was not the ragged cultists of Mega Borealis, but the lost sprawl of Doria. Its fall to the plagues of Nurgle, briefly contained by the Dontorian firewall, was an offence to the God Emperor and imperiled the entire planet, and the Order of the Bloody Rose would purge it. Hrethnar was not immediately convinced. Dontoria had been quiet since she arrived, with no particular massing enemy forces, but she couldn't really ignore a command from a living saint. She moved her ships into orbit above the hive sprawl, and her forces marched out, approaching the blackened defensive fort walls of the hive's terminals. A cloud of green vapour hung over Doria, and shambling figures could be seen on the walls, dressed in civilian clothes, gang outfits, and the uniforms of those regiments originally tasked with the defence of the hive. Doria and its citizens were evidently now lost. As Celestine lifted her eyes to the sky, the clouds lit, and Hrethnar's remaining capital ships commenced a pinpoint lance strike, breaking holes in the defensive walls as the Sisters of Battle surged forward. What followed was, in all practicality, the burning of an entire continent. Supported by more ships arriving at stations above the hive sprawl, the screaming sisters methodically fought through Doria, unleashing explosive bolts and sheets of holy promethium into the hordes they faced. Over the following days, Doria was utterly destroyed. The continent turned into a pyre on the orders of the living saint and purged clean of Nurgle's taint. Its burning remains a warning to Abaddon that Vigilus would not be his to take. But the despoiler had been pretty busy too. Throughout the entire northern region of the Nachmund Gauntlet, worlds had come under attack by as many warlords as the Black Legion sought control of the corridor. Dozens of worlds had fallen. The mining colonies at Vendigast, the great shipyards of Proctil and Thule, the mercantile coalition of the Thought Ascendancy, all had been devoured by the warbands and fleets of the despoiler. The fleets of warsmith Vezrax plagued the Mandeville points of many systems, including Vigilus, preying on translating ships and forcing reinforcements to run a blockade of fire to get through. And on the surface of the Bastion world, his commanders, Zagramothis and Broga the Red Hand, continued to coordinate disruptive attacks. Zagramothis in particular, starting an attempt to hunt down Inquisitor Cavolus. Abaddon wanted Vigilus to suffer, but he vented his fury on the entire region, his commanders terrorizing the Northern Gauntlet. On the planet, after the Coronal War and the Wars of Faith of the Ministorum, the power balance had shifted. By this point, military coordination and religious fervour went hand in hand. The Synod Vigilant was now the main coordinating force everywhere but on Mega Borealis, and the Ministorum had amassed more power than either the planetary governors or the tech priests of the Mechanicus had ever had. And with this power, they struck back with holy fury at the remaining heretics. Hyperia was held as a model for the planet, a holy city for the miracles that had happened there, despite the fact that its outskirts were still under assault. The few Space Marine forces left on the planet viewed the rise of the Synod with a wary eye, all except the Black Templars, who pledged their allegiance eagerly, Castellan Avar Strideland leading a crusade into the forgotten Dirkden Hive in order to purge it of Xenos. Fabricator Vorsh, of course, of Mega Borealis, retained control of his forge complex and sent out delegations to attempt to rebuild in Storval, and while the new power balance on the planet settled, Doria burned in the cleansing flames of the Saint. Vigilus was now alone, a bastion surviving within the golden halo cast by the orbit of Hearthlack, but it was unlikely to stay that way for long. The forces of chaos still lurked in the darkness of the void, even as the main part of Abaddon's fleet made its way down the gauntlet to its next target, the night world of Daravar. And with that, we get to the end of the Vigilus bit of the campaign. From here, the story of the Nachmund Gauntlet takes us down the perilous warp route as the war makes its way south, towards Sanguiterra. And it's interesting how the tone has changed since the start of this campaign. 8th edition 40k was a bit of a landmark for Games Workshop, a complete relaunch of the game with new rules and armies and a storyline, and it brought in new players, and the tone then was all about including as many people as possible in the new story. So the early part of the Vigilus story reflects that. There are as many factions included as possible, every major group apart from the Tau, Necrons and Tyranids. Almost all 40k players could find some way to get involved, and those 8th edition supplements have been very big on grand battles with the big poster factions of the setting: Ultramarines, Space Wolves, Orcs, Chaos Marines. These 9th edition books, like Vigilus alone, are a little different, less concerned with trying to shoehorn in every faction, and more interested in picking one or two current ranges and making a story about just them, which is why the last part of the Vigilus story is almost entirely about Sisters of Battle. The latest Plastic Sisters range had been released near the end of 8th edition, and much of the 9th edition marketing, which had initially dealt with the fight against the Necrons and the Pariah Nexus, featured Sisters of Battle. Games Workshop was making a concerted effort to turn Sisters into one of the more prominent, recognisable faces of 40k. The tone of 9th edition was also a lot darker, maybe as a reaction to the Technicolor of 8th edition with its returning Primarch and glorious crusade. In this book, the war is described horrifically, not heroically. You're always aware that while the faith of the Imperium might work in the end, millions are fanaticized and martyred before it really has any effect. The story here just feels a lot more desperate and grimdark than the last two books and their glorious sieges and massed running battles. Anyway, that's where we currently leave Vigilus. The next book, Rift War, happens around the same time as the events of this book and deals with Harkon world claimers advance down the Nachmund Gauntlet and finally takes us to the world of Daravar. Until then, thanks for watching. If you'd like more 40k, well, I've got a whole other second channel, and of course you can like and subscribe, join the Patreon or the YouTube membership scheme for early videos, or buy some merch. See ya!